So the message is dealing with our ups and downs in an upside down world. And so as you look at that slide, that is a good reminder of what this has been like. It's been some ups and downs here in this upside down world. You know, last week I talked about a roller coaster, and the roller coaster is a crazy ride where you go up and down, sideways, upside down, and spinning your head around. Well, that's kind of how it's been here. We've been on a roller coaster ride. Thank you for those of you who are patient and stuck with us, because this is a good description of life right now. And so, as we get back into to looking at the message, if you have your Bibles, open up to Genesis chapter 37. And as we look at chapter 37, we are going to look at some things here that relate to Joseph. And you know, as you are settling into some of the things that you're doing, you're probably getting into some routines now. Looking forward to getting back to some old routines, I'm sure, and looking forward to that. But you know, it's been crazy as you go out there. You go into a store, and it's like, okay, you can only come in this way, and you can only go out that way. You look at the line, and they have things marked out. Only go this way. Seems like if you have any stock in plastics, that's probably going to go way up. You see plastic things up all over as you go into grocery stores. You go into to the gas station. You know, but it is a bit of an upside down world right now. Some things that you see happening, they seem reasonable. Other things, they seem a little bit overreach. And some of it doesn't make any sense. I don't know if you guys saw on the news where some official decided to fill in all the skate parks with sand in California. I thought that's just ridiculous. I mean, that's one of the things. The kids are already bored at home. I mean, like, probably that is hurting the most is the parents are saying, now what do I do with them? You know, that's right. Maybe empty the swimming pool and let them go out there. But on the other side of the country, in Florida, most of the beaches are open, but you're not allowed to sunbathe. So you can walk, you can bike, you can fish, you can run, you can surf, you can even swim, as long as you keep moving. Now, the only thing I thought about that, how can you fish and keep moving? I don't know. I like to fish. I usually like to stay in one spot, so I don't know how that's working for them. But so anyway, you see that this has been a roller coaster, but you know, in some ways, it's almost now like a seesaw. And you know that old seesaw. You know, they used to have those in the parks. I don't know if they still have them like they used to, but you know, one person sits on one side and the other on the other, and then one pushes their legs up and maybe to push someone up, and then you know, put your weight and goes down, and you just the seesaw go back and forth, you know, and that's kind of fun, just up and down. Now, if you were in my family and you had a brother like I had, well, you know, he was a little bigger, a little stronger, and he delighted in making the seesaw a little more entertaining, you know, right? I get pushed down and just kind of stay there, and then you're stuck up in the air. Or then he'd get really creative and ornery, and then he'd step off of it, and then you come crashing down. And you know, that's kind of how I see that the life has been right now, is it's a bit of a seesaw, and that is what's happening. As we're seeing what's happening in our culture and our society now, it's like it's up and down, back and forth. It's not our normal. We're looking forward, quite honestly, to getting things back to normal. We're looking forward to hearing more good news, because we're probably weary and tired of the bad news. We may love the low gas prices, but if you cannot go anywhere, what good is that, right? It's great to have that many people. It's great as you go to the stores. There's not that many people in the stores. However, there's all these restrictions, and I don't know. It's like, okay, I got to put the mask on. I got to make sure there's only 10 people there, because as you go in, people are counting. It's just becoming, you know, something that's like, forget it. I just order online, or I'll wait. Now, one thing I didn't wait for was my hair. Yeah. So you can tell me how good of a job it is. You can just post there if you're watching online. I did that myself, and you could say, yeah, I can tell. Jennifer did help me out a little bit. You said, you know, you kind of got one bald spot here and the rest. So I said, okay, well, I couldn't see back there, but I just couldn't stand it any longer. But nevertheless, as we understand, as look this, we need to be safe, because this is a deadly virus, and so, you know, we're their kids because they're working in places where it could be a high infection, whether it's in the healthcare or whether in certain industries. So, but at the end of the day, we're all tired of this, aren't we? We're all ready for this to be over with. We have been on this seesaw long enough, and sometimes it feels like we're suspended in air. It's like, okay, come down and go right back up. And we're concerned about long-term effects on our economy. We're concerned about the long-term effects of mental health on people. This is a killer for extroverts, though. I mean, if you're an extrovert, this is, not being able to see people and hug people and greet them. That's tough. Now, introverts, they're probably wondering what in the world you're complaining about. They're like, man, this is great. Can we continue this? One group is energized by people, and the other is drained. Now, I wonder if Joseph felt like he was on a seesaw. He was asked to go see his brothers and check on them, but the challenge for him on that was they hated him. And then they were so far away. So why do they hate Joseph so much, and why do they want to kill him? Why are the brothers deceptive? How can they be so callous and to sit down to eat while their tired brother, who just brought them food, is thrown into the pit? How could they lie so easily to their father? How could they all agree to sell their brothers to strangers and profit from it? How did they think that this was going to help them between them and their father? I want to look at Genesis chapter 37. Are we okay, guys, up there? We're good? All right. Let's look at Genesis chapter 37, verses 12 through 25. Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "Are your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he said to him, "I will go." That was gracious of him. I think if I was him, I would say, "Can't a servant do that?" But he said to him, "Then go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. A man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock." Then the man said, "They have moved from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, 'A wild beast devoured him.' Then let us see what will become of this dreamer, of his dreams." But Reuben heard this, and he rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay any hands on him, and that we might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father." And so it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic and vari-colored tunic that he was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal. As they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels, gum and balm and myrrh, on their way to bring down Egypt. Guys, can keep the sound down up there? Now, as we saw last time with Joseph's dreams and colorful robe, we see that Joseph was on this seaside, this seesaw, and his brothers were on the other end. So here they have all of the cards in their favor as Joseph is approaching them. And so the first thing that we looked at, and we looked at last time, is that some things are just best kept to ourselves. As we see in Genesis 37, 3 and 4, here we see that Joseph, he has this dream, but as he has this dream, it is also told of us that Jacob says that he loves his brother, loves Joseph more than the other brothers, and so Joseph, he recognizes this, he knows this, but yet he's 17 years old, and at 17 years old, he probably goes ahead and not without thinking, and says, hey, I have this dream. And so he begins to tell him this dream. But what is the biggest problem with this dream is it also taps into the problem that is in this dysfunctional family, and that is the favoritism. And anytime there's favoritism in a family, it really does destroy the closest relationships that we have, and we have to be able to confront it. Joseph isn't the cause of their hatred, he's the target. They couldn't hate their father in whom they wanted to love, but they could hate Joseph instead, and that's exactly what they did. And that's why they directed all their hatred at Joseph. And Joseph was a young man who probably didn't realize that this was going to turn out the way it did, and so he probably, though, should have recognized and said to his father, something's wrong. This isn't right. They already know that I think I'm special, so, don't send me out there. He should have been able to confront that. But if you begin to read the history and you begin to look back, and as I did this last week, and you look and you say, okay, we see this favoritism that Jacob has towards Joseph, but if you go back a little bit, you'll see that also that happened in the family in which Jacob was raised, where his mother, Rachel, loved Jacob and showed him favoritism, even over to the fact against his brother Esau, to be able to steal that birthright and also the blessing from his father. And so this continues on, and so this is what God is going to have to do, is take Joseph out of that. Just as he's in that pit is a good representation of what is going to experience in his life as he's gone through the pit of what he's experienced in that dysfunctional family. And so God will have to pluck him out of that pit in order to be able to see that he does something new and different with his life. Because hatred and jealousy had consumed them, and they needed another perspective. If you look at verses 6 through 9, as Joseph says, listen to me, listen to this dream I have. And then he tells him another dream. He says, listen unto this. And the scripture tells us that it just gave them more reason to hate him, more reason to want to be able to do away with him. So when we get to verse 12, we see some reminders here that when trust is broken, because they can't trust their brother because they think that he is lying, they think that he's just being arrogant, and so now he becomes a target. They don't see him as a brother. They don't see him as an individual. What they do is they see him as someone who is to be done away with. But they saw him in the distance, it says in verse 18. And before he reached them, notice, before he even reached them, they had already made up their mind. They said they plotted to kill him. They plotted to kill him. Now, they didn't care the fact that he had spent days trying to get to them. They just wanted revenge. If you were to look on the map of where Hebron is where they were and where their father was, and if you were to go north, it's about 50 miles north to where they go into Shechem. And so that's a long ways away to go to be able to have your flocks taken care of. But then he goes there, and we're going to cover a little bit about the history of Shechem, which is very interesting in a minute. But he gets there and he's like, okay, they're not there. And then they go another 15, 20 miles further north, putting them right on the trade route that we're going to talk about in a minute as well. So now there is no description of Joseph having any type of animal, because, for instance, if you were to have a camel back then, that would be like, having a real expensive vehicle today. If you're to have a mule or donkey or something like that, okay, that's like your good old Ford pickup type of thing, But all he had was those 2 feet that God gave him. And so it could have taken him up to 5-7 days to be able to get to him. And even as we find it, when he's in Shechem, he's like, I'm lost. I don't know where I am. And he doesn't know where he is, and so he has to get direction. And he says, oh, well, and he just happens to run into the guy that's to be able to say, yeah, I actually heard them say that they're going into Dothan. And he heads up that way. Now, they don't care that he had brought food. They don't want to know about his journey, his travel. That's not of interest to them. Now, I don't know what your relationship would be if you had some siblings. I know there are times when I was younger, and I'd want to try to follow my brother as he would go with his friends off somewhere. And my brother literally would take rocks and throw at me so I wouldn't follow him. And I was like, oh, man, and I just wanted to go and hang out with him and be with him. But, the reason now as I look back on it, I just thought he was just being mean to me. But I now know that he was going to do something he shouldn't have been doing. With those guys. That was the issue. And so, that's what we see here with Joseph as well. I mean, he's arriving here, and they don't want him there. Why are they in this area? And we're going to explore that a little bit, because they're not supposed to be. It's Warren Wiersbe who puts some questions here, and some good questions for us to ask. He says, first, why were Jacob's sons pasturing their flocks 50 miles from home when there was surely good grassland available closer to Hebron? The possible answer is they didn't want anybody from the family spying on them. If you go far away enough, then those who know you hopefully won't see what's going on. And that was kind of their intention. I mean, to take the herds and the flocks 50 miles away. Well, the second question is, why did they return to the dangerous area near Shechem when Jacob's family had such a bad reputation among the citizens? I mean, they were known as being those who had slaughtered the Shechem people from Shechem, and we're going to read that in a second. Well, the brothers were involved probably with people of the land in ways that they didn't want Jacob to know about. This is a place where they massacred these men after one of the leader's sons took their sister Dinah and raped her. And the question I always thought was, well, Dinah, what are you even doing there? Perhaps she was attracted by some of the things that she saw with the other women of that area. Maybe, like young girls would be just like, oh, maybe they've got some new type of fashion, new type of dress, makeup, whatever it might be. There was something that attracted her there. And so she went there. She probably should have had some of her brothers with her, but being young and naive. And so she gets raped. And the guy rapes her, but he also says, well, then I want to marry her. And then so the brothers get involved, and this should have been between Jacob and the leader, and Jacob really should have taken more of a stand. But the brothers say, kind of like, Dad, you're not going to do something we are. And so they say, basically, if you will circumcise yourself, then we will marry your wives, and you can marry ours, because that's what was proposed to them from the leader of Shechem. And they says, okay. And that must have been a painful time to go through that, because all the adult men were going to be taking their time to be circumcised. But they misuse what the purpose of circumcision for. What is the purpose of circumcision? It is to show that removing the foreskin, to be able to show that I am now committed to God. And so the purpose of being able to commit to God, they then use deception of what the very purpose that God had given to Abraham of circumcision now, to be able to use it for evil. And they go in and they slaughter the men. Look with me at Genesis chapter 34, verses 25 to 31. Now it came about on the third day, when they were in pain, all the men had been circumcised, that two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, and they would be from Leah's line, each took his sword and came upon the city unawares and killed every male. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem, who had done the rape. with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went forth. Jacob's sons came upon the slain and looted the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds and their donkeys and that which was in the city and that which was in the field. And they captured and looted all their wealth and all their little ones and their wives, even all that was in their houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me, making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and my men, being few in number, they will gather together against me and attack me, and I will be destroyed, and I and my household." But they said, "Should we treat our sister as a harlot?" What's interesting is that Jacob is more concerned about his reputation. He's more concerned about how people will think about him instead of recognizing that his daughter has been raped and being able to protect her. And so the brothers have to step in and taking that aspect of authority. Now that's back in chapter 34. We're in 37, so some time has gone by. So now we find these same brothers here, and it seems to be maybe the one place where they were victorious, where people recognized them. Maybe they felt like they got a bit of respect there. Who knows what it was in their twisted way of thinking. What are they doing back in this area? Are they gloating? Are they looking for more plunder? It says that they took the wives and the children and everything, and maybe they were visiting distant relatives of the plundered women. We don't know. But that is the point. They didn't want anybody to know. Evidently, Joseph wasn't there long enough to find out what was going on, because now he goes up to Dothan where they've moved on. But there's another question that's even more puzzling. Knowing that his sons hated Joseph, why did Jacob send him out to visit him alone and wearing that special garment that had aggravated them so much? One of Jacob's trusted servants could have performed the same task faster, and Joseph not got lost, and perhaps just as efficiently. That makes sense as you think through it. But the answer is that providentially, God had his hand in it, and he was working to accomplish his divine purpose for Jacob and his family, and ultimately for the whole world. It says in Psalm 105:17 that he sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant. So that in the craziness of things that we even see happening, we can say that, yes, some of these things don't make sense. But as we look to the Lord and ask for his guidance, we'll see that God maybe has a reason for this that we don't even know. And so we need to look to the Lord and remind ourselves of Joseph, that even in the most uncomfortable, the most difficult, the most challenging of circumstance, God's hand providentially can be over that, just as he ordained Joseph to go to Egypt, and this was the way that he would accomplish it. Remember that passage in Isaiah in 55? God's ways are not our ways. Just as the heavens are above the earth, so God's ways are different from ours. And yet it tells us that his word will still go forth. His word will still be accomplished. It's going to accomplish that which it is sent out to do, just like the rain that comes down to accomplish that which it is sent for. But the combination of hatred and envy is lethal. It simmers in the heart and waits for the spark that will set off the explosion. The brothers didn't have to be tempted in order to decide whether or not they were going to harm Joseph. They didn't need any encouragement at all. All they needed was the opportunity. All they needed was him just to show up. Most crimes that take place aren't planned. Most crimes that take place are taking place because there's an opportunity that presents itself. And the evil mind begins to work, and the emotions and the greed and the evil takes over. Now, that doesn't mean that the person hasn't already thought that through in their head or their heart 1,000 times before. It's just now the opportunity presented itself, and so then the crime takes place. Whether it's hatred, whether it's rejection, whether it's abuse, whether it's lust, you name it. It's like a gasoline can that is full and sitting outside in a hot summer day, and then the opportunity comes where someone has a match just to say, wow, let's see what happens. And you know what's going to happen? Kaboom! I had an experience like that. We lived in Minnesota. The house we lived in, we loved the place, but it was on a hill, and it had a ton of trees on it, and a little pond in the back, and so every year we had to go through and get all the leaves, and we had a big place where we could put all them in this big place, the mulch area, and then there was this little pit down by the lake where we would gather all the twigs up and put them there and burn them, and I mean, this one year we had a bunch of it and had it piled up there. I don't remember how big of a pile was, but it was a big old pile because we had, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 trees just within that 1 acre lot there. And so kind of like Vince, like your house, you got a bunch of trees around there, and so that and so I went and I had this old can from a gas can from someone had in their boat, and so it still had a little bit of gas in there, and so I poured just a little bit on it, and then a friend came by and he said, "Hey, what you doing, Pastor?" And I visited with him and talking with him, and so he was there, and I said, "Well, I'm just trying to burn up some of this stuff," and so I had put a match in there and just had just a small flicker. It was taking a while for this wood to get soaked with the gasoline and so forth, but I knew, as Jennifer had always said, get a 5-gallon bucket and get a water hose. So I went to go and get the water hose, and so as I was walking, I was keeping my eye on the back and watching Eric to see what he was doing, and I noticed that Eric had no, that's not burning fast enough. So he took it and he poured a bunch of gas on this thing, and as I was watching this, and I'm glad I went back to get the hose, because I was probably 20, 30 feet away, because I turned and go, kaboom! And it would just, boom, shot up like 20, 30 feet in the air. And then, I don't know if it was the shock of it that scared him, or if it was the explosion, but Eric got knocked down, and he was on his rear end. And I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. But now as I look back on it, it was pretty funny. But, I mean, it was so loud that Jennifer comes out and she says, "Do I need to call the fire department?" And I'm looking over at Eric, who is completely shocked. And I said, "No, but if he doesn't get up in a minute, we're going to need to call the doctor." and his only response was, "Well, I didn't know that would do that." Well, now you know. But that was just waiting for the opportunity. You put the gasoline on there, okay, and you got some fire. Guess what's going to happen? Well, this is the kind of situation that Joseph walks into. And he walks into this situation where there's division. And they say, "Here comes that dreamer." Could he, now that could also be, comes that dream expert. Someone who thinks he knows more than us. Joseph's dreams got him into trouble. But 13 years later, other people's dreams would also, and he's in prison. How unsearchable are God's judgments and his ways past finding out. From all this, we see the brothers taking their aggression out on him with their frustration and their rejection from their father Jacob, who he's simply bringing them food and a message. Look at verse 14. Then he said to him, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back." So he went from the valley of Hebron and he came to Shechem. What's interesting about this, depending on your translation, but the New American Standard is pretty close here, because it has the word welfare twice. Now, basically, what that literally means is it's written in Hebrew is, go check on your brother's peace. Because the word shalom is used twice there. So check on their welfare. Check on their safety. How are they doing? It's been a while. The Hebrew word shalom means well or whole or sound. And it is often translated by the word peace. Bring back a good word of peace. Because Joseph, if you recall, in the first couple of verses in chapter 37, it says he brought a bad report back. And so Jacob's trying to say, bring some good news back this time. The problem is they didn't want to be found. And they thought Joseph was coming to spy on them. They had been burned before. In verse 2, we read about that. So they had forgotten, they hadn't forgotten that. They were hurt. They were upset. And the reality is, hurt people will hurt people. People have been hurt. People have gone through rejection. People have gone through pain. They will hurt others, because that's what they've experienced. And it's only love and acceptance can heal years of rejection and bitterness. As one commentator says here, starting with Cain's murder of Abel, man's inhumanity to man is painfully recorded in both biblical and secular history. We're made in the image of God, and we belong to the same human family, and yet we can't seem to get along with one another. Everything from family feuds over lottery winnings to civil wars blamed on ancient injuries gives evidence that the world desperately needs a Savior who can make hearts anew. Amen? I wonder what difference it would have made. What difference would it have made if Jacob would have shown love and acceptance to their other boys? What would have become of them? They probably wouldn't have been so deceptive and so scheming and rotten. But they were fighting for attention and love of their father. And their violence is a way of masking their pain and bottling up that bitterness, waiting for it to explode. The reality is, there is no time limit on pain. As long as our memory is intact, we can recall in seconds either joy or pain, as well as all the emotion that goes with it. It can take us right back there to that very moment. I have prayed with many people for healing, forgiveness, restoration from things such as rape or abortion that they've done, or abuse, or other types of sin. And my conclusion is that we need to allow God to heal the person over time. And not only to heal them of the pain, but to heal them of the memory of it as well. And to speak forgiveness and grace into that. Whether we're victims or instigators, we need God's grace. We need God's grace as a healing oil that applies generously to our life. What we look at as we see this passage and we see these brothers is that whether for good or bad, there is and there are consequences to the decisions that we make. There's always consequences to the decisions we make, whether for good or bad. And so we can see from the Scripture that as Joseph arrives, they take the food, they start eating it, they throw him in the pit. And Reuben, he wants to try and go and rescue him. Now the question is whether Reuben really wants to rescue him as a good brother, or some would think maybe it's because there is a motive that he had with that. Was his motive that he would profit from it himself in terms of his relationship with his father? Let's look at this passage. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and to cover up his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midian traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers, and he said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" So they took Joseph's tunic, and they slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in blood. And they sent his vari-colored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please examine it and see whether it is your son's tunic or not." Then he examined it and he said, "It is my son's tunic." A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. So Joseph tore his clothes, and he put on sackcloth in his loins, and mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. You know, what happened there is kind of like what you maybe, if you've read the story, The Lord of the Flies. And when the boys find the pig, they'll say, kill the pig, and they're all kind of just focused on that. And that kind of a moment is what they see with Joseph, is kill him. That seems to be the solution to their problems. It seems to be a solution to their anger and their hatred. And getting revenge may seem like it somehow brings some sweetness to it, but it's like taking a bite of a lemon. That aftertaste is there, and it's very bitter, and it doesn't go away. Ironically, these traitors are distant relatives. Going all the way back to Abraham, take a look at Genesis chapter 25, 1 to 18 sometime, and you'll see that these traitors have actually their roots in Abraham from Ishmael's line. Matter of fact, in verse 17 of Genesis 25, altogether Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area of Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt as you go toward Ashur, and they lived in hostility toward all their brothers. So for these guys, even if you were to say, hey, you're from my father Abraham, they didn't really care. Because as we read about Ishmael's line, it says he was at odds with all of his brothers anyway. They were fighting with one another. They fought all their tribes related to them. So adding slave trader to their title and to a distant relative, no problem. If there's money to be made. Well, just as we need to choose our friends wisely, we have to sometimes watch carefully for some relatives because you're stuck with those. And you sometimes have to put borders on those relationships in order to keep them healthy and have healthy borders and relationships there. And Proverbs 28:13 says, "He who covers his sins will not prosper." He who covers his sins will not prosper. Eventually will come back. God's law is unchanging, but people still think that they can defy it and not experience the consequences. But among Jacob's sons, one sin led to another as the men fabricated the evidence that would deceive their father into thinking that Joseph was dead, killed by some wild beast. And Jacob would have no problem identifying that special robe which he had made. He had no way of testing the blood. As tragic and treacherous as this deception was, the reality is that Jacob was reaping what he himself had sown. Years before, he had killed a kid goat in order to deceive his father in Genesis chapter 27, verses 1 to 17. And now his own sons were following in his footsteps with a goat and some blood. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until my son is in the grave, until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. One commentator, Leopold, says, "And they sent the long-sleeved cloak and had it brought to their father." Notice what it says there. They sent the coat up ahead. They did not have the dignity enough to be able to confront their father by themselves with their own lie. It says they sent it up ahead. Unwilling to confront him personally, the brothers sent a servant to Jacob to show him the evidence and tell him the lie that had been concocted. And this was a brutal way to treat their father. As Proverbs 12:10 says, the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. Years later, Jacob would lament, all these things are against me, as we see in verse 36. When actually all things were working for good, he just couldn't see what God was doing behind the scenes. This doesn't mean that God approved or engineered the brothers' hatred and deception, or that they weren't responsible for what they did. It does mean that God is so great that He